Hello everybody, welcome to this next instalment of Sparking Interest here at the ASFP. Today we've got somebody of significant notoriety and experience that's going to be talking to us about a whole raft of different subjects, all to do with fire safety in buildings. Effectively anything that's going on in terms of the Building Safety Act and effectively what governance will end up looking like for all of us in this industry in the future years. So I'm going to very quickly read a quick resume of experience which I'm going to have to read from, so I apologise in advance. So, Sir Ken Knight, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm very well indeed, thanks, Mike.
Excellent, good. So, Sir Ken Knight was, from 2003, was London Fire Commissioner. 2007 became Her Majesty's, at the time, Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor. Was responsible for part or whole of the London Olympics fire strategy, became a consultant in 2013, 2014 became the lead commissioner for Tower Hamlets, or the lead fire commissioner for Tower Hamlets, became a Grenfell expert on the advisory panel for high-rise buildings in 2017. Ken is a champion of the Chartered Management Institute, a fellow of the IFE, is a past master of the Worshipful Company of Firefighters and chair of BSI Committee FSH 0. That is quite a sizable resume, Ken.
Well, thanks, Mike. Well, yes, it's a very long introduction. And the older you get and the longer in tooth you get, unfortunately, the introductions get longer. But first of all, I'm grateful for you referring to me as Sir Ken, but I think for the purpose of this interview, a conversation really, rather than an interview, I'd rather be Ken, even though, and I need to say this, I'm really proud, of course, to be a Knight of the Realm, mainly because it's not for me solely, although it's interesting, it's only the third time that a serving chief has ever been knighted in history. It's for the teams you work with. And importantly, it's recognition of the work that so many do in the fire industry. So I think for the purpose of this interview, Ken is fine, but I think we're going to get on great. Excellent,
and Ken it will be. And I think 3 serving commissioners being knighted through the history of the Fire and Rescue Service. Maybe if our now King Charles is watching this, once he's got his coronation out of the way, maybe wants to check a list of current or past serving fire officers or chief fire officers, maybe he can add a few more to the list.
Well, there are some great people, not just a commissioner or chief fire officer. There are some very hardworking people. Yes. I just wanted to correct one thing in your intro, but there's no reason why we shouldn't do it on air, as it were. I wasn't actually fire commissioner in Tower Hamlets. It was the lead commissioner on a government intervention on a failing authority.
Apologies.
So they're called commissioners, but not to be confused with fire. It was nothing to do with fire.
Not to be confused with a fire commissioner.
It's nothing to do with fire.
So we've got an awful lot to get through, but we have the rest of our lives, I suppose. In terms of where we are, where we've come from in the last 6 years, so I think it'd be the 6th anniversary of the Grenfell disaster this coming June. The public inquiry finished. That's now leading on to slightly more formal, I think, probably is the best way to put it, proceedings. But outside of all of that, outside of the sort of the eye of the storm, is everything else that's going on in terms of what we've been expected to do as an industry within construction and specifically fire. We as an association are working on a whole raft of different things to support that with our members. But we'd noted down a few things here to go through, and so we've got some key sort of subjects that we thought we'd have a chat about. The first one on the list, and these are in no particular order of importance, by the way. I thought we'd start off with competency. So predominantly, we seem to be looking at individual competency. We're working on the basis of SCEB, which is skills, knowledge, experience, behaviour. Forms part of the basis of ASFP's competency pathway. And of course, that is linked to the 8000 series standards now of competence, individual competence, principal designers, principal contractor. Where do you think where do you think the important elements of competency sit? And in your experience and all of the things you're currently involved with, do you think there's still a weakness within either what you're seeing being done? Do you think there's an area that we're missing, or is it more of a concern of actually once you've developed something that people follow, how it's then audited and evidence? Because of course, I think the important thing is it's not necessarily saying it's competency; it's the ability to evidence somebody's competency.
I just want to backtrack as well, because you rightly said the major milestone in so many of our lives was being the Grenfell tragedy. And the public inquiry will report this year, I'm sure. I would be disappointed if the inquiry finds for all of us in the industry something new that we didn't know about, because you at the SFP in particular, but so many have been working incredibly hard since that tragedy, not to wait for results of an inquiry, but to get on with those gaps that can be self-identified. I'm sure it will have played a very valuable part, the public inquiry, in learning the lessons, which is the purpose of a public inquiry. But I hope there won't be lessons that are a shock to us from the public inquiry, because we should have known. But one of them has been competency, hasn't it? And I think it's true to say those elements of make up the jigsaw of competency are really important, but more important, the individual themselves recognising their limitations of competency and being able to say, whether it's a contractor, whether it's an end user, a specifier, a procurement person, I'm outside my comfort zone and my competency, and not overstate the work that you can do if you're in the professions, because that's when it'll start to fail, and I think has started to fail, whether it's from fire risk assessment to fire designers, of overstating their areas of competency for the purpose of doing the job. And that isn't helpful, and it undermines the whole of the industry.
Yeah, and that's actually... what you're saying echoes what we were talking to a lady called Andrea White, who has set up an organisation for women who work within fire safety and fire engineering, and ASFP is an advocate and a sponsor. And I won't go into too much detail on that, but effectively we're a facilitator of engaging our member companies with Andrea and her team to get more women into the industry, retain them, improve their ability to grow, and more women on board, gender pay gap, all of those things that are constantly on the table for discussion and improvement. And she said in an interview she did with us here that one of the elements of competency she thought had been missing or used to exist, but for some reason had sort of disappeared slightly, was the know your limitations part, the definition of competency. And because, of course, nobody wants to admit to having limitations, and I think and certainly within in the sphere of actual physical construction, if you're a subcontractor that's employed to do A, but then your principal to your order says, well, while you're here, can you do B? And B happens to be outside of your trade or professional ability, knowledge, skill, or even, dare I say, for some level of formal certification to do that work. They feel pressured to do it, or they don't not want to do it because, of course, it's additional revenue. I think that's where that part of competency needs to be,
yes,
driven
you're absolutely
harder.
right. But it does require, doesn't it, therefore, to make sure those skills gaps, those competency gaps, are filled where there are currently shortages.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the tendency for people to overstate their competency because there's a gap and no one else to do it. And fire engineering has been a good example of that.
Yeah.
So if there's a gap there and people will move into that, overstating, intentionally or not, their competency because there is no one there to fill the gap. So I think it's double-edged, that, ensuring that the industry generally, and I talk about the fire sector, but I think the fire sector is, everyone in the fire sector has a duty to make sure they've got people in the wings, in training, in preparation to take on those new and challenging roles. So you don't have to have people that are tempted to overstate their own competency.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult thing at the moment for, as you say, certain professions or trades, because there is a lack of the ability to be able to train whether that's training, which you effectively get some level of certificate of attendance or can evidence X number of hours, or whether it's something like, for instance, the IFE exams, where you sit an exam and you get a qualification. In certain areas, I think there is a distinct lack for people to actually access the ability to become competent within that trade or profession. And that's an area that all of the representative associations need to look at filling. We certainly are within our sphere. I know my counterpart, Ian Moore at the FIA, very much looks at competency within the active industry. And I think that is part of the problem. Is it? It's not a question of saying, well, you're doing something that you're not competent to do. Because the answer will come back, well, there's little ability for me to become competent other than experience itself. So I think that's an interesting dichotomy. Where do you think? Do you think competency will end up being the responsibility of a particular organisation, the respective? In our case, we're a trade association. Or do you think it will end up somewhere in HM, in government?
Well, I don't think it'll end up in government, and the move from government, as it were, towards the new regulators, whether it's the construction products regulator, is likely to want it to be in the armoury of sufficiency to meet their requirements. I don't see the mandatory movement towards that in the near future, but I generally hope that those that are procuring services will recognise they need to seek in their contractual obligations the competence of the people doing the work. And I think that's the responsibility of all of us, isn't it, to make sure they do. And right down to the end user, that asks some critical questions before they contract for that person to come and give advice or even undertake the work.
I think that procurement is an interesting part of the chain because designers and engineers get qualified to a specific level within their profession, and they would be specifying products within a design, and that then gets put out to tender. It gets awarded, and then you have people within the principal contractor who are then awarding work. They are procuring, but you rarely hear about people within the profession of procuring products and services within construction being that there being effectively a line of the ability to become competent.
No,
what drives their decision. Now, you could, the cynical, if you've got a cynical person sat on the sofa now with us, Ken, and neither of us are cynical. We're more pragmatic than that. But they would say, well, procurement is only ever a decision based on price, without, necessarily considering all the factors. But of course, it's hard for the principals to the orders, the main contractors effectively, if there's no mechanism for that person in procurement to become competent in a broad section of all of the different products and systems and materials that are used in construction. I think that's a significant challenge for them to be able to evidence how somebody who makes purchase decisions is competent outside of it being a commercial decision.
Yeah, but it isn't. Yeah, you're right, Mike. But it's not just the individual in procurement, although I think that is a really key area to ensure those procuring services. Because I don't think like you. I don't talk in terms of procurement as in procuring goods only. But it's also the services. Yeah. It might be the principal designer, it might be the principal contractor, it might be the subcontractors. So those that are involved in procurement generally and the procurement processes ought to be seeking. First of all, you make a very good point. It's absolutely critical in life safety areas of procurement. it's important it's not just about the bottom line best price.
Yeah.
And you might argue it could be in other areas of procurement, whether in local government or the private sector, it's about the cheapest tenderer wins. I don't believe that's the case in life safety. And indeed, it shouldn't have been to date, because even in terms of the local government terms of best value, it was never about cheapest.
No.
It was in the life cycle of best value, not just now. And I think it's an important distinction.
Yeah.
But it means, therefore, that the competencies that we've just talked about isn't just those grand professions that we say ought to get their act together in the building industry or the construction industry, the safety industry. They need to be in those procurement services of those people, and for the procurement processes to understand what they're asking for and why in those minimum levels of expectation. They include, of course, those competencies, but they also require the confidence that some of those professions are appropriately covered with PI insurance. So that you've got, there's a range of things that you'd want to put in that procurement model to satisfy you that it was giving you best value in real terms.
Absolutely.
And not just cheapest.
No, and I agree. And the PI conversation, of course, is developed over the last few years, and we've seen examples of designers not actually being not being able to gain indemnification for the design of certain aspects of a building because they can't evidence their competency within it. And passive fire is one of those. We've seen a number of cases where a practice is not being in a position to be able to definitively create a design around the discipline of passive fire because they couldn't gain PI insurance to indemnify them for creating that design because they couldn't evidence competency within the discipline of passive fire. I don't know how widespread that is. We hear the odd one, but that's a perfect example of
well, it is a pressure. I hear it too as a pressure in the fire sector generally. But it does go to prove that not only insurers, who you would argue are part of this solution as well, because they will also be pretty definitive in defining who's appropriate to carry out the work in their terms, but they need to have confidence that there are competent people out there as well. And I think the two go together. And if the competency goes alongside the competency we've just talked about, with insurers having confidence, then actually the competent people are more likely to be able to get the PI as well.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a full circle.
So moving on, one of the other areas that we've been significantly involved with and have effectively contributed to, along with a lot of our peers, is the golden thread. And that's been evolving for a number of years now. What are your thoughts on where it currently is in its current guise, and where do you think it will eventually end up as an entity?
I think it's been evolving very quickly, actually. Of course, Dame Judith Hackett, in her initial and subsequent reports, saw it as the hub around which all other spokes were fixed. And I think many of us at that time were questioning, well, what is it, what does it do, and how is it? But it has emerged. First of all, there is a new British standard for the golden thread, BS 8644, which a good colleague of mine, Aman Sharma, chaired. And it has actually shown there needs to be that umbilical of information running right through the building, from design through to completion, through to occupation and beyond, that's going to have a wealth of, hopefully, predominantly, and I think the building safety regulator will be looking for this, digital information that's held. But the wealth of information isn't and doesn't need to be available to everyone. It needs to be tailored for the user at the end, whether it's the person that comes in and does modification and amendments to the buildings 10, 15, 20 years on, or the day-to-day information that Judith Hackett talked about for the residents' voice, which she talked about also the residents' not just voice, but responsibility, in order that they've got current and timely information about their building and risk. So it needs to be carefully thought about that the information, I call them the fibres coming out of the golden thread. Some will be absolutely relevant to technical people in their understanding of the building design and changes. Some will be modifications. Some will be about the residents themselves and the occupancy. Some actually, well, my DNA is fire. Some will be for the incident commander arriving at the fire themselves, having that golden thread information that's relevant and timely and pertinent to making key decisions in the event of a fire. So I think Judith Hackett is right. It will form the basis of a huge joining up of information that we probably never had before. Of course, the automotive industry have had it for a long time.
Yes.
You can have a failure in your car and have a recall on a part around the world.
Yeah.
Now, it's not quite as simple as that for buildings, but the golden thread goes a long way to having that digital information readily available. In new buildings, rather simpler than existing.
Of course.
But I think it will emerge very quickly indeed through all the stages.
Yeah, and I think digital technology will allow this to be more comprehensive. As you talk about the threads, it will be more accessible because you can, we all have laptops and tablets. And,
exactly.
I know some of the technologies that the fire and rescue services are now using to aid and abet them to be more to fight fires more efficiently and also lower the risk to themselves is significantly improving. You can scan existing buildings now, and those are available. You make those available as in a file, and if you turn up and there is a fire, you instantly have effectively a three-dimensional model of that building and all the rooms and everything in it. So I think that in itself is, and of course, because it's a technology-based accessibility, the technology is very cheap. So compared to what it was even 5 or 10 years ago, so it's affordable, and I think that's one of the things that will drive this is the affordability of the technology that improves information and knowledge and communication at the point of it being needed. And
that communication, if you think digital, the digital expansion of that into digital awareness, digital training, awareness of the resident, of the occupier about their surroundings, about VR and AR opportunities for training of individuals, what to do in the event of fire. It means in the case of particularly typically high-rise residential buildings in our cities and towns, it becomes a very easy way and much more effective way of disseminating key safety information that is not reliant on language either.
No, because
all of us go on an aircraft and have a message that's multilingual, but there's hardly any sounds on it. What to do in the event of safety?
That's right.
And actually, it actually translating that into a rather more complex way into digital awareness and training is going to be absolutely part of the golden thread information that's there.
So in terms of the digital data method, one of the things that we've looked at is and it's pretty much sort of relating to our industry. There's a number of providers that now supply these digital platforms where you can store information post-installation of pacifier systems and applications. But the one thing we've spotted is that there is not a lack, but there is a difference in continuity of these systems. I'm not sure where the mechanism would sit for bringing those, standardizing those more, because of course they're all individual companies that are providing them. I'm assuming that they want to create, their own individual value propositions compared to their competitor. But of course that might not help the person needing it at the point of a fire or refurbishment of a building or something else. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there needs to be, or is there somewhere that that there is a mechanism for that within?
Yeah, I do, but I don't think it's about a single platform. I don't think we'll get to that. But I think probably you're describing the world since Grenfell in particular in that space that was recognised by British standards, and British standards isn't a remote organisation. Of course, it's technical experts coming together from the industry, and in doing so, producing the British standard for the golden thread, which quite clearly outlines what is expected. It's not a requirement; standards aren't a requirement, but it's helpful as common ground to be the inclusion of a golden thread. I think that will make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Now, the fact it's a British standard, and perhaps even now some of the viewers on this conversation won't have seen it. I urge them to go and have a look at it, because I think it will drive that. And I'm not sure I like standardization in a prescriptive sense, but it will drive those essential requirements of what is a BIM fire solution.
Yeah, I think there's minimum levels of continuity, effectively, that I think everyone would have to adhere to, and then outside of that, there would be slight variations. I suppose depending on what sector you sit within the design, construction of a building, there may be, idiosyncrasies that, of course, are applicable to one part of professional trade or industry than another. So just on that standard again, it was the it's
8644.
8644
on golden thread. It was published last year.
Yeah. So if anyone is interested in educating
and I think that's part
further,
1. I think it's 8644 part 1.
Yeah.
Published last year and produced, of course, by the industry itself.
Yeah, of course. No. So if anyone's interested in that, you can download it from the BSI site or various other sites that provide BSI standards. Have a look, because that is certainly probably, as you say, as Hackett sort of suggested, it was the hub of the wheel and all the spokes of those threads that that come off. So I think it's important that people do familiarise themselves and educate themselves and align themselves to what is going to be the golden thread.
And not just at that stage, which is so critical in design and construction and completion, but as I said, that occupation stage. So on that frequency of fire risk assessments that are then included in the golden thread, and people, the successor fire risk assessors can go back to in that digital format and see. You can see that evolving very quickly indeed to ensure that the building people responsible for the building have all the information that they require.
And quite often that's overlooked, isn't it? By certainly within the sort of middle ground of the RRBA plan of work, in terms of the architects are probably more considerate about the occupiers than people who make products, people who build buildings, because they're not that emotionally engaged with who occupies it. It's only when then obviously occupation happens, the next sort of group or profession that become more considerate about the occupiers, of course, is facilities management and that sector, where of course they are then managing those buildings, those environments, for and on behalf of the people that occupy them. You don't always necessarily get the consideration at the time of building it, post occupying, and I think that's an area as an industry that sort of construction in terms of products and actually physically building needs to think about more, is that there is somebody who's going to be living or working in this building. And
you've hit on a really interesting aspect that FM in this whole area, once the building is completed and once it's taken over, and along comes facilities management who take on the responsibilities and in some of them legal responsibilities, the regularity of testing or maintenance and checks, and it is an area that there's some very responsible companies in that space. But I suspect that there isn't a collective understanding, as there is in the fire sector, of what now needs to be done. And perhaps we have a responsibility as the fire sector to make sure they do and can and work together with that wider sector that's going to ensuring the continuing safety of people and the safety of the building.
Yeah, and of course, the regulatory reform order has been with us a long time now, and the responsible person is the responsible person. And I think I'm always amazed sometimes within certain sectors of the lack of understanding of even that. And that's been around now for, a significant number of years. And who is the responsible person? You'd be amazed at, certain, businesses and have multiple buildings that, things like supermarkets where the store managers aren't necessarily that well adversed with their level of responsibility under that order, and it is quite. I'm not saying it's frightening, but it's concerning that that message still doesn't. It's not either communicated to them or they haven't understood it themselves. But no, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility, to manufacture and install things to push down. As much as you say, the fire and rescue service, has a responsibility to push up, because of course. The fire and rescue service is more than just a fire and rescue service now. It does so many other things, doesn't it?